Hi, my name is Anya Gruber, and I'm an archaeology PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin. And today I'll be talking a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing in Plymouth, Massachusetts. So first, a little bit of background on this project. First thing that you may have noticed in the title slide is that I referred to the site as Plymouth/Patuxet. And this is to recognize the Wampanoag history and claim to this land. And this is especially important now because the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe is now losing its reservation status. And that means that they will no longer have jurisdiction over their own land, which includes 321 acres. And as Cedric Comrell, who is the tribal council chairman of the tribe, wrote, taking our land is a direct attack on our culture and way of living. So this is just to emphasize how important land is in the past and absolutely today as well. So I refer to it as Plymouth and Patuxet, as do many other archaeologists and historians, in order to recognize this claim. So this project is a partnership between the Fiske Center and UMass Boston, or at UMass Boston and Plymouth Plantation, as well as the Town of Plymouth, Pilgrim Hall Museum, and the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribal Historic Office. The project is run by Drs. Krista Baronic and David Landon at UMass Boston. And our team includes undergraduates, graduate students, volunteers, and lots of specialized archaeologists who all contribute something specific to the project, different methodologies, different theoretical backgrounds, which creates a really rich environment for a lot of really exciting intellectual work. So I am very proud to be part of this project. A little bit of more background on what I've been doing. So as I mentioned, I am a PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin. And I got my start in archaeology at the Plymouth Field School. It was the very first archaeological experience I ever had, and I loved it. And so for the first couple of years, I started out as a student, starting in 2015. I then became a TA as I completed my master's program at UMass Boston. And there I worked with Dr. Heather Trigg, who works in New Mexico. And I studied the colonial era environment at a Spanish ranch site. And after I finished with that, I decided to move on to complete a PhD. And I decided to kind of go back to my roots and what I love most, which is New England archaeology, which is where I got my start. It's where I grew up. So that's really what I've been digging into lately at my PhD program. So a little bit more on this project. So the main site is located on Burial Hill. So that's in downtown Plymouth. It's facing the waterfront. It's right next to, it's kind of adjacent to the big stone church and the big white church in downtown Plymouth. And it's a cemetery. It has been that way since the late 1600s. But this site was originally a native village and the site of the first fort and village built by the English colonists. So some of the goals of this project are to identify the location of the original 1620 fort built by the English colonists. It's also to understand the relationships between colonists and the Wampanoag, who were absolutely still living here, even as colonialism was starting to ramp up throughout the 1600s. There were still Wampanoag people living here. And we also want to know what the environment was like in the colonial period and how the environment changed over the course of the 17th century. So what were Wampanoag people doing on this landscape? What were English people doing? How did those differ? What were those similarities? So that's something that we want to know. So a little bit on what we've found. So this project has been going on for several years, and we've found some incredible discoveries that we're all really excited about. And so this picture here is one from last summer, summer of 2019. And this is an excavation unit. This is one that I was part of. It was a very, very exciting unit. And here, circled in red, is evidence of the palisade wall, which would have been surrounding the English village at this time. So the palisade wall would have been made by wood pounded into the ground. And since it was made out of wood, it doesn't preserve very well. So all the actual wood has degraded over time, and what's left are these dark stains in the soil. And based on the shape and the size, and sort of the composition, what the soil feels like, it's all very, very subtle. But based on those metrics, we can figure out where house foundations were, where these palisade walls were, and we can figure out the dimensions of these settlements on this hill. So this is a very exciting find. Finding the actual bounds of the village is something that we've been really hoping to find here in Plymouth. It's pretty unusual to have something preserved from such a long time ago, but there are other precedents, other sites where these things have been preserved. So to find this has been really, really exciting. But as you can see, they're just stains in the soil. But to us, it's everything. So this is kind of a good, gives you a good idea of what we are working with daily when we're excavating. We're looking for these kinds of soil stains. Another thing that we have found that's really, really interesting is that there was a lot of trade happening between Native people and European colonists. And this is shown by Native-made items in English settings and English-made items in Native American settings. So this is also something that's quite significant in New England. So in other parts of the United States, for example, in the Southwest, there's been kind of more of an understanding that there was trade between Native people and Spanish colonists in that case. However, in New England, it hasn't been quite as accepted by historians and archaeologists that, yes, there was trade between these groups of people. It just hasn't been something that has been accepted in the community. However, here we're showing that actually, yeah, there was a lot of trade. These people were sharing goods and technology and ideas as well. And while there was a lot of conflict, there's also some degree of cooperation and trade. So that's something that we've been able to really show in our excavations, which has also been very interesting. So this is another thing these are some photos to show the kinds of typical artifacts that we find. You can see here, this is my friend Victoria, and she is holding a piece of pottery. So when we have people stop by in our excavations and they say things like, "Are you finding gold?" We say, "No gold, but we found this really cool 17th century ceramic." And this can tell us so much. So this type of ceramic, for example, it's called borderware. And borderware is only made in a specific set of years. So it was made in the late 1500s and early 1600s. So if we find this ceramic, we know exactly what set of years it was from. And so if we find that, since it was only made up until the early 1600s, we know that the site and the layers, the soil layers that this was found in, and the other artifacts around it are also from that time period. So that gives us a really good indicator of what time period we are looking at. And that's a really exciting one specifically because it is so early. And that's exactly what we're looking for, is early occupation. And this green ceramic here in the corner, it's also borderware. Very, very important, very, very exciting. It's personally my favorite type of ceramic. The photo above the green ceramic, this one, that is redware. So that is a type of, we call utilitarian ware. So it would have been, it wasn't like a pretty dainty tableware. It was used, it had a job. It was glazed only on the inside so that it was watertight. So any food or any liquid that was held inside it would not have leached out. And that was a very exciting find because we found so much of it. Usually when we're dealing with very early artifacts, we don't get a huge volume of them. So everything that we get is very precious. And so finding that almost an entire vessel was really exciting and very unusual. So that was a very cool find as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about my research in particular. So I am an environmental archaeologist. I am interested in how humans and animals and plants all kind of interact with each other and all the complexities within those relationships in the past. So I want to know, what did forests and coastlines look like in the colonial period, and what kind of plants were growing there? And then that leads to some more questions, like what kind of resources did people have available and what did they grow? And then why is learning about food, agriculture, and natural resources important? So there's a lot to say about that, and I'll get into a little bit more. So another word, so I said a couple seconds ago that I'm an environmental archaeologist. So another word that describes what I do is paleoethnobotany. So to break that down, paleo means old, the same root as paleontologist. But of course, any archaeologists will say, we don't dig dinosaurs, but for the record, I think dinosaurs are pretty cool. And then ethno, which means culture. And then botany, which is of course plants. So you put all three of those together and you get the study of cultures in the past and plants. So that's a little bit of what I do. I want to know how humans and plants are connected. So in order to do that, I'm going to go a little bit into the types of methods that I use. So one of the main things that I and other environmental archaeologists and paleoethnobotanists use are soil cores. So this is when you take a long aluminum tube, a hollow tube, and you use a machine or a hammer and lots of strong people to get it into the ground. And usually you do this somewhere where the ground is pretty wet, so a swamp, or you do it in an actual lake. You take it out onto a boat, get it into the lake bottom, so then you, and then what you do is you take it out of the ground or the lake, wherever you stuck it into, and you saw it in half so you can see all the soil that gets stuck inside of it. And what that does is you get a record of the soil over a number of years. So soil accumulates a little bit every year. And with that soil that accumulates, you get all the stuff in the environment. So you get all the pollen, you get all the little bits of plant debris, you get everything that's kind of just in the environment stuck in there with the soil. So what I want to do when I get a soil core is get a record of all that stuff in the soil so I can go through and see how that stuff changes over time. So I'm specifically interested in the pollen that gets stuck in that dirt. So I'm sure you have observed in your daily life how much pollen is in the air. There's a lot of pollen in the air, especially this time of year. Right now I'm recording this in late May, and every day when we go out, everything is covered in a layer of yellow dust. So you can see how much pollen is produced by plants. And that's been like that for hundreds and thousands of millions of years, is all these plants producing so much pollen. So what I do is I use that pollen to understand how the environment has changed over time. So I take all my soil cores, I open them up and I divide all the soil into individual little bags. And then I use chemicals such as hydrochloric acid and hydrofluoric acid, which are pretty harsh chemicals. So you can see there's a photo where I'm wearing a lab coat and gloves. And I should be wearing goggles too, but I have my glasses, so at least I was protected that way. But what we do is we separate, basically what I do is melt the soil all around the pollen. I leave the pollen, get rid of everything else. And then what I do is look at that pollen under a microscope, and I keep track of where that pollen was in that soil core. So I can see what kind of pollen is growing 500 years ago, what kind of pollen was present 200 years ago, and what kind of pollen was present 100 years ago. And I can see how that changes. And what that tells me is what kind of plants are growing at each of those intervals. So I can then see how it changes. So this is a little bit, so just to take a little bit of a step back, these are some examples of what pollen looks like under a microscope. So every species or every genus of plant has a different shaped pollen. So some of them are really round, some of them are kind of bumpy, some are smooth, some have different parts to them, some have little holes in them, which are called pores, and some are just kind of spiky. Some of them are very, very cute. So this is just kind of to give you an idea of what I spend many hours looking at under a microscope. Personally, corn pollen is one of my favorites. I think it's very adorable. So then I can talk about, so once I do all of that, then I can talk about the actual forest and what that means, what that meant for the people living there. So what I've found, and what other scholars have found as well, and what I've corroborated, is that the environment looked very, very different in the 1500s and the 1600s and the 1700s and the 1800s and the 1900s and now. So all the time the forest composition has been changing, and all the time people are doing different things on the landscape that contribute to changing ecologies and changing forests and changing coastlines. So when the Wampanoag were living in Patuxet, the environment was very, very different. This is before European colonists were here. Forests were comprised of huge old growth trees, and there are meadows underneath them. Unlike today, where we have a lot of scrub and a lot of little kind of shrubs interspersed between the trees. And all of our trees, a lot of them are really tall, but they're not very, very old the way that these trees would have been. Our coastlines also looked very different. It would have been more forested. And also the soil would have been very thick, it would have been very dark because of the burning cycles. So people would intentionally set wildfires to clear out the brush. And that was really good for a lot of the forest animals that lived there, and for a lot of forest plants that then thrived in the cleared out conditions and the very, very fertile soil that was created by these burning events, which is actually very, very good for soil. And then, of course, the meadows were one of the most important features. And it was really useful for people who were gathering plants and for growing plants and for hunting animals here. Because this is the kind of environment where deer, for example, thrived, and where berries like blueberries and other important plants thrived as well. So there were changes that came once the colonists started to take over this area. So a lot of the forests were cut down in order to grow different kinds of crops. So the colonists brought plants like wheat and barley, which required much greater, flatter, cleared areas for agriculture, rather than plants like corn and beans that were grown predominantly grown by the Wampanoag. And trees were also used for things like lumber for shipbuilding, and that became a major commodity in coastal Massachusetts in the 17th century. And another thing that I know a lot of people are really interested in, and I'm interested in as well, is food in the 17th century. So I thought I would talk a little bit about that as well. So this will hopefully be a big part of my dissertation. I haven't done a lot of the research yet that I need to do in order to answer a lot of these questions myself, but I think I will be able to talk a lot about what kinds of things people were eating and like how they were preparing these foods in the past. But another interesting thing we found at the Plymouth Field School is that fish were used as fertilizer when growing crops, especially corn. So this is something that's been kind of a part of popular culture, a part of popular mythology, for a very long time. And it turns out it's very true based on Wampanoag knowledge, as well as our archaeological excavations where we found fish scales and planting holes. So that's something that's very interesting and shows kind of the use of fish, not just as a food, especially herring, but also as fertilizer for plants. Some of the plants that colonists brought over to North America in the kind of more in the mid 1600s were wheat, barley, lettuce, carrots, a lot of the kind of garden crops that we think of today. Also, cattle and pigs were introduced in the 1600s. So Native North Americans, there weren't really any large land mammals that were domesticated. It just wasn't, it didn't happen. It wasn't necessary. So cattle and pigs were really the first domesticated livestock brought into this area. And a lot of native plants are still really, really important to us today. So maize, maize and corn, same plant, of course, like can't imagine summer without corn. Squash, and also amaranth, which is a grain, is still widely consumed today. So why is all of this important? So this is the Thanksgiving story and the story of the Pilgrims is so ingrained in our society. And I think that archaeologists really have a responsibility to be able to interrogate the myths and a lot of the false information that goes along with those narratives. And I think the work that we're doing in Plymouth is really deconstructing a lot of the sort of assumptions that we take for granted and making sure that all sorts of voices are recognized in this work, and making sure that the information that we're presenting is accessible and accurate and fair. So I hope that what we're doing is working towards that. And that's what I hope to kind of carry with me throughout my career. If you're interested in any of what I've talked about today, we have a lot of different social media platforms where you can find out more. So the Fiske Center is online at Instagram, so at UMB Archaeology. We post photos, usually we post them throughout the year, but there are a lot that we post during the summer when excavations are happening, which is obviously not this summer, but hopefully will be next. We also have a blog. I contribute to that sometimes. A lot of current students write for the blog. There's also Facebook and also YouTube, where my friend Katie is posting short videos every Friday. And those are really fun and gives you a great kind of idea of what our sort of excavation actually looks like. So I definitely recommend checking those out. Those are very fun. There's also a virtual tour of Plymouth Plantation that references a lot of the work that the Fiske Center in UMass Boston has been doing. And I'll post that in the comments. And if you have any trouble finding that out, you can email Tim Davidson, who will then email me. He has my email. So if you have any questions about anything that I've talked about today, I am more than happy to answer those. I really love talking about all of this. So I'd be very happy to hear what kind of questions and comments you all have. So thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned a little bit. And like I said, please feel free to email me. Very happy to talk more. Thank you so much.